Julian needs a woman who can secure his future, not a penniless orphan. Imagine crossing a brutal desert for the man you love, only to find him placing a gold band on a wealthy heiress's finger. Today, we witness Evangeline Vance, a woman abandoned in the dirt, who finds an unexpected ally in a scarred cowboy. Together, they will prove that honor is a currency that never bankrupts. Drop a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to ride with us into this legendary tale of justice.
The stagecoach didn't just stop. It died a hard death in the middle of Tucson's Main Street. The wood groaned. The iron rims shrieked against the sun-baked rock, and a cloud of red dust choked the air until a person couldn't tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Evangeline Vance stepped out into that blinding heat, coughing the desert out of her lungs. Her fingers clung to her late father's small pocket pistol, tucked deep inside her traveling cloak. It was still warm from 3 hours ago. Back on the trail, when the highwaymen had tried to take the coach, she had fired a shot through the window, not to kill, but to show them that the people inside weren't cattle to be slaughtered. She had saved those passengers, but out here, nobody knew that. Through the haze of grit, her eyes found the heavy oak doors of the town church. They were wide open, letting in the hot wind and the sound of a preacher's steady drone. Eva felt her heart drop straight into her boots. She walked forward, her green wool dress heavy with 3 weeks of trail grime. Through the threshold, she saw him. Julian Sterling. He looked exactly like his tintype photograph, polished, combed, and handsome. But he wasn't standing alone. Next to him was a woman in imported ivory silk, her blonde hair catching the altar candlelight. 6 months of letters. 6 months of promises about a partnership, a shared life, and an honest future on the frontier. And there he was, placing a gold band on another woman's finger. The crowd inside turned as Eva boots creaked against the floorboards. The vows cut short. Julian's face drained of color, turning as white as the bride's dress. Eva, Julian's voice shook. You're 2 weeks late. The telegram said the coach broke down. But we couldn't wait. The bank was closing in on the ranch. The blonde woman, Amanda Pendleton, stepped forward, her silk dress rustling like a diamondback in the brush. She looked Eva up and down, her eyes measuring the frayed cuffs of Eva's sleeves. Amanda reached into a small velvet purse, pulled out a handful of heavy silver dollars, and let them drop to the floor. They fell with a dull, mocking clink into the dust. "For your trouble," Amanda said, her voice dripping with San Francisco high society ice. "A return ticket back east. Julian needs a woman who can secure his future, not a penniless orphan who can't keep time." The church went dead silent. Eva looked at the silver in the dirt. Her ribs ached from the coach ride, and her pockets were empty. But she didn't bend her knees. She looked past Amanda, straight into the hollow eyes of the man who had broken his word. "Your silver might buy this man loyalty, ma'am," Eva said, her voice calm, carrying clearly to the back pews, "but it cannot appraisal my worth. I came to this territory as a free woman, not a piece of livestock to be bargained for or sold short. You keep your coins." Julian flinched like he'd been struck with a whip, but he didn't move to help her. He just stood there, bound to his new fortune. Eva turned her back on them, her chin held high, and walked out into the scorching sun. She had no money, no home, and a continent of dust between her and the life she used to know. But as she stood on the wooden boardwalk, she knew one thing for certain. The frontier hadn't broken her yet. The heat out on that porch was a living thing. It pressed down on your chest, thick and heavy with the smell of old pine and hot iron. Eva stood there, her fingers curled tight around the handle of her wooden trunk. The wood was splintered, rough, it bit into her palm. But she welcomed the sting. It kept her grounded. It kept her from looking back through those open church doors. The townspeople had spilled out onto the boardwalk now. They lingered like turkey vultures, waiting for something to stop moving. They wanted to see her cry. They wanted to see the city girl from Boston drop to her knees and beg for a handout. Then came the boots. It wasn't Julian's light, hurried step. These were heavy boots, spur rowels clinking against the dirt with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Clink, step, clink. Eva didn't move. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains rose up like broken teeth against the blue sky. A shadow fell over her. It was wide, broad-shouldered. A man stood there, blocking out the glare of the noon sun. He took off his Stetson, his dark hair matted with sweat at the temples. A jagged white scar cut right through his left eyebrow, giving his face a hard, unforgiving cast. But his eyes, they were a striking slate gray. They didn't have the hollow, shifting look that Julian had. They looked right through her, steady and still. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel turned over in a creek bed. "I'm Silas, Julian's brother." Eva braced herself. She didn't know if this one carried a handful of silver coins, too. "If you're here to offer me a ticket back to Boston, Mr. Sterling, save your breath. I've had enough charity for one afternoon." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look at her with that soft, sickening pity that makes a person feel small. He just looked at her trunk, then back at her face. "I don't give charity," Silas said. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Charity makes a beggar out of the person receiving it, and a tyrant out of the one giving it. It's a bad bargain all around." He reached down. His hand was twice the size of hers, dark from the sun and covered in thick, pale scars from old rope burn. He didn't ask for permission. He just wrapped his fingers around the iron handle of her trunk and lifted it with one arm, slinging it into the back of a weathered buckboard wagon parked by the hitching post. "The Sterling Ranch belongs to both of us," Silas said, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Julian bought himself a fancy wife and a mountain of banker's debts this morning. But the cattle still need tending, and the books are a holy mess. More than that, we got 12 families living down by the creek, working the leather, shoeing the horses. They got children, lads and girls who don't know an A from a branding iron." He climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the leather reins. He didn't look back at the church. "I need someone who can handle the ledgers and teach those kids how to read," Silas said. He nodded toward the empty seat beside him. "You'll have your own roof, your own key, and a square wage at the end of every month. It's honest work, Miss Vance, a fair exchange between equals. You want the noon stage back east. You sit on that bench and wait. You want to earn your bread. Climb up." Eva looked at the wagon wheel. The iron rim was gray and scarred from the trail. She looked at Silas's hands, steady on the leather reins. There was no mockery in his face, no hidden conditions. He was offering her a contract, not a handout. He was treating her like a person who had something of value to give. She caught the iron handrail. Her green wool dress dragged in the dirt, but she pulled herself up onto the hard wooden bench anyway. Silas gave the reins a snap. Gidap. The wagon lurched forward, the wooden spokes groaning as they left the church behind. The dust rose up behind them, a thick red curtain shutting out the whispers of Tucson. They rode in silence for the first 3 miles. The road was nothing but 2 deep ruts cut into the caliche, winding through the giant saguaro cacti. The desert didn't care about broken hearts. It just endured. The sun beat down until Eva's skin felt tight and parched, but she didn't complain. She watched the way Silas drove. He didn't whip the horses. He guided them with small movements of his wrists, feeling the animals through the leather, respecting their strength. A few miles out, the trail dipped toward a dry wash. Silas slowed the team to a walk. Julian wasn't always a coward, Silas said, his eyes fixed on the horse's ears. The war did something to him, made him afraid of being poor, afraid of being ordinary. When Amanda Pendleton rode into town with her father's banking ledger, Julian saw a shortcut. He thought money could buy him a clean slate. "And you?" Eva asked, her voice dry from the dust. "I think a man's slate is never clean," Silas said. He pulled a canteen from beneath the seat and handed it to her. It was wrapped in wet canvas, cool to the touch. "Every choice you make leaves a mark. You break your word to a person who trusted you. You don't just hurt them. You leave a piece of your own humanity in the dirt. Julian thinks he won a fortune today. I think he sold himself short. Eva took a sip of the water. It tasted of iron and leather, but it was wet, and it cleared the grit from her throat. She looked at Silas' profile, hard against the blinding sky. "Why did you step up, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could be a terrible teacher. I could ruin your ledgers." Silas let out a dry, short bark that might have been a laugh. "You stood in that church with an empty pocket and a broken heart, and you didn't bow your head to a woman who owned half the banks in California. That tells me what I need to know about your ledgers, Miss Vance. A person who knows her own worth won't lie on a piece of paper." He pointed his whip toward the horizon. "Out here, the law is thin," Silas said. "The government is 1,000 miles away, and the sheriff only comes out when there's a body to bury. If we don't hold ourselves to a standard, if we don't respect the basic dignity of the people we live with, then the desert wins. We just become beasts with boots on." The wagon climbed a small ridge, and the Sterling Ranch came into view. It was a sprawling collection of wood and adobe buildings. Nestled in the shadow of the canyon, there was a large barn, 3 corrals filled with horses, and a massive main house with a wraparound porch. But Silas didn't turn the horses toward the main house. He veered left, down a narrow trail that led toward the cottonwood trees by the creek. "That's the main house," Eva noted, her eyes lingering on the whitewashed timber. "That's Julian S.'s house now," Silas said, his jaw tightening. "Amanda's already having her trunks hauled in from the station. You wouldn't find any peace there, and I won't have you subjected to her brand of manners." He pulled the team to a halt in front of a small, isolated cabin. The logs were old, weathered to a deep, dark gray, but the mud caulking between them was fresh. A stone chimney rose up on one side, and a small porch faced the running water of the creek. Silas climbed down and carried her trunk to the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key, holding it out to her on the palm of his hand. "The cabin belonged to an old Mexican blacksmith named Mateo," Silas said. "He passed on last winter. It says small, but the roof don't leak, and the well behind it is sweet. It's yours, Eva. Your own territory." Eva took the key. The metal was cold against her sunburned skin. She looked at the little house, then at the man standing before her. For the first time in 3 weeks, her shoulders dropped. The tight, terrified knot in her chest began to loosen. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. He nodded once, tipping his hat. "Get some rest, Miss Vance. Tomorrow the work begins." The interior of the cabin smelled of old wood smoke, dried cedar, and honest earth. It was only 2 rooms, a small kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a main room with a rope bed and a sturdy oak table. Someone had swept the floor recently. There was a fresh bucket of water sitting on the sideboard, and a small jar of yellow desert marigolds sat in the center of the table. Eva sat down in the lone rocking chair by the hearth. Her knees were shaking. She hadn't realized how hard she had been holding herself together until she was finally alone behind a locked door. The tears came then. They weren't loud or angry. They were just the quiet, exhausted tears of a woman who had reached the end of her rope and found a knot to hold on to. She thought of her father, dying in that small, damp room in Boston, surrounded by boxes of unsold books and unpaid bills. "Go west, Evangeline," he had whispered, his hands trembling against her cheek. "There's room to breathe out there. Room for a person to be judged by what they can do, not by who their grandfather was." She had gone west for a promise. The promise had turned to ash in a Tucson church. But as she looked around the quiet cabin, she realized she was still standing. By evening, the heat had broken, giving way to the cool, sharp air of the Arizona night. Eva washed the trail dust from her face with the cool well water. She changed into a clean dress of blue calico, simple, unadorned, but whole. She was standing by the small stove, trying to coax a fire out of some dry mesquite chips, when a soft knock sounded at the heavy timber door. She opened it to find Silas. He had a lantern in one hand and a covered tin pail in the other. Brought some supper, Silas said, stepping inside as she gestured him in. Caleb's wife, Martha, made some beef stew and sourdough bread. Figured you wouldn't feel much like cooking after 3 weeks on a hard bench. Thank you, Eva said, taking the pail. The scent of onions and seared beef made her mouth water. Please, sit down. I was just trying to get the stove to cooperate. Silas set the lantern on the table. He took the small hatchet from his belt, knelt by the hearth, and split 3 pieces of mesquite into kindling with 3 clean, effortless strokes. Within minutes, the stove was drawing, the wood crackling with a warm, steady hum. He sat down across from her at the oak table, his large frame making the small room seem even smaller. He looked at the jar of marigolds, his rough fingers tracing the edge of the glass. Julian came down to the corrals an hour ago, Silas said quietly. His eyes stayed on the flowers. Amanda wants you off the property. She told him it's an insult to her family to have his cast-off living by the creek. Eva stopped with her spoon halfway to her bowl. Her hand went still. And what did Julian say? He didn't say much, Silas muttered, his voice darkening. He looked at his new gold watch and muttered something about peace in the house. But I told him the day I let an outsider dictate who works this land is the day I put my irons back on. You have a legal contract with me. Eva, I am paying your wage out of my half of the cattle sales. She can touch you here. Eva leaned back, looking at the steady flame of the oil lantern between them. Why do you stay here? Silas, you clearly don't agree with your brother. You don't live like him. Silas pulled a small pocket knife from his vest and began whittling a piece of cedar scrap. Our father built this place from nothing. He came out here with an old mule and a broadaxe. He didn't build it to make a fortune. He built it because he wanted a place where a man could stand on his own 2 feet without a landlord or a master leaning over his shoulder. When he died, he left it to both of us. If I leave, Julian sells the whole valley to the Pendleton Bank within a year. Then the people who work here, the vaqueros, the hands, they become tenants. They lose their independence. He looked up, his gray eyes locking onto hers. You see that blacksmith? Caleb, Silas asked. He was born a slave in Georgia. Walked all the way out here after the war with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hammer. He's the best iron worker in the territory. On this ranch, he gets paid the same dollar as any white hand, and his word is as good as gold. If the bank takes over, Caleb goes back to being a servant in his own shop. I stay to keep that from happening. Eva felt a deep surge of respect for the quiet man sitting across from her. He wasn't talking about politics or laws written in leather-bound books in Washington. He was talking about the life right in front of him. My father would have liked you, Silas, she said softly. He spent his whole life fighting for the same thing in the city. He used to say that the true test of a civilization isn't how many banks it has, but how it treats the man with the hammer. He sounds like a smart man, Silas said. He was an honest man, Eva corrected, which meant he died poor. But he left me with my education, and he taught me that knowledge is the one thing nobody can take away from you. A person who can read and write can't be cheated by a bad contract. They can't be ruled by a slick tongue. Silas nodded, his knife shaving off a thin, curling ribbon of cedar. That's exactly why I want you teaching those kids down by the creek. The world is changing, Eva. The wire fences are coming in. The railroads are cutting through the valleys. The old days of just living by the gun are over. If these kids don't get learning, the new world is going to roll right over them. He stood up, shoving the knife back into his pocket. He swept the cedar shavings into his palm and tossed them into the stove, where they flared up with a sweet, resinous scent. Tomorrow morning, I'll show you the ledgers, Silas said, moving toward the door, and I introduce you to Caleb and the families. Don't mind Julian if you see him on the trail. He's living in a cage he built himself. You just keep your eyes on the road ahead. Eva stood by the door as he stepped out onto the dark porch. The desert sky was brilliant now, a vast field of cold, white stars stretching out into the infinite black. Good night, Silas, she said. Good night, Eva. Sleep tight. You safe under this roof. She locked the door and turned back to the quiet room. The warmth from the stove was gentle, and the smell of the cedar kindling filled the cabin. For the first time since her father died, Eva didn't feel like an orphan drifting in the wind. She had a purpose. She had a partner who understood the value of a promise. She climbed into the rope bed, listening to the soft, rhythmic gurgle of Skull Creek outside her window, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The morning sun didn't ask for permission. It just rose up over the rim of the canyon, bright and sharp as a new tin plate, burning the blue mist off Skull Creek. By 7, the heat was already creeping up the valley, but beneath the wide, sprawling branches of the great live oak tree near the blacksmith shop, the dirt remained cool and damp. Eva stood by the trunk of that old oak, a heavy leather-bound ledger tucked under her arm. Her blue calico dress was clean, pressed flat with a cold iron she'd heated on her small stove the night before. She watched the dust down the trail. First came the boots, small, hesitant boots. 3 young boys from the vaquero cabin slouched toward the tree, their wide-brimmed straw hats pulled low over their eyes. Behind them walked 2 girls, sisters, their dark braids swinging rhythmically against their cotton shirts. They held hands, looking at Eva like she was some strange creature dropped out of a winter sky. Then came a shadow, wide and steady. Silas walked down from the corrals. He wasn't carrying a whip or a rope. He had a long, split-log timber cradled in his massive arms, his muscles straining against the coarse fabric of his work shirt. He dropped the timber onto 2 notched stumps he'd set into the dirt the previous evening. It landed with a solid, satisfying thud. "Morning, Miss Vance," Silas said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Brought another bench. Caleb's kids are coming down the path now. Figure you'll need the room." Eva smiled, the tension in her neck easing. "Thank you, Silas." "It is perfect." Silas didn't linger. He gave the log a firm shake with his hand to make sure it was steady, then tipped his hat and walked back toward the stables. He didn't say a word about what he was doing, but the action spoke clear enough. He was building a foundation. A moment later, 3 more children emerged from the shade of the blacksmith shop. They were Caleb's kin, 2 boys with woolly hair and bright, curious eyes, and an older girl named Ruth who carried a slate tablet like it was made of thin glass. The vaquero boys stiffened on their bench. They moved an inch to the left, leaving a distinct gap between themselves and the end of the log. It was an old habit, a line drawn in the dirt by grown men who didn't know any better. Eva walked over to the center of the circle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold. She just opened her leather ledger and laid a row of smooth, white river stones along the top of the split-log bench. "Come close, everyone," Eva said, her voice clear and thong-dong, matching the rhythm of the creek. "Look at these stones. They've been tumbling in that water for 100 years. Some are round, some are flat, some are gray, and some are brown. But if you drop them back in the creek, do they change the way the water runs?" The oldest vaquero boy, Miguel, squinted through the sun. "No, ma'am. Water just flows." "That's right," Eva said, looking at each child in turn, bridging the gap on the bench with her eyes. "The river doesn't care about the color of the stone. It treats every single one the same because they're all part of the same bed. This bench is our river. Out here we leave the town's foolishness behind. Every mind on this log starts at the exact same line." She turned to Ruth, the black girl holding the slate. "Ruth, sit right here in the middle. You have the best handwriting, and I need you to help Miguel with his letters today." Ruth hesitated for the space of a heartbeat, then sat down dead center on the log. Miguel didn't move away this time. He watched her lay her slate flat. The gap vanished. Eva spent the next 3 hours breaking the world down into small, manageable pieces. She taught them the alphabet, tracing the letters in the red dirt with a pointed stick before having them copy the strokes onto their slates. She showed them how numbers worked, using the river stones to demonstrate how 5 pieces of iron or 5 head of cattle were the exact same weight, no matter who owned them. If a cattle buyer offers you $3 for a steer, but the ledger says the steer is worth 5, what do you do? Eva asked the class. "You take the 3 if you're hungry," one of the younger boys muttered. "No," Eva said firmly, her voice ringing out through the oak leaves. You show him the ledger. You read the numbers out loud. A man with a pen can rob you faster than a man with a Colt if you don't know how to read the paper he puts in front of you. Knowledge isn't a luxury for the rich folks in the cities, children. Out here, it's at your shield. It keeps you free. From the dark interior of the blacksmith shop, the steady clink 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 of Caleb's hammer provided the rhythm for her words. The old man was standing by his forge, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the coals. Every now and then, he'd pause, his hammer resting on the anvil, just listening to the sound of his daughter Ruth reading aloud from her slate. By noon the wind began to swirl, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of alkaline dust from the flats. Eva dismissed the children, watching them run off toward the creek cabins together, their old divisions forgotten in the shared scramble for shade. She was packing her books into her satchel when a shadow fell across the dirt. It wasn't Silas' shadow. It was lighter, narrower. Julian Sterling stood at the edge of the oak's canopy. He wore a clean linen shirt, his silver pocket watch chain glinting in the harsh light. He didn't look at Eva. He looked at the rough wooden benches Silas had built. "You shouldn't be doing this, Eva," Julian said, his voice low, lacking the strength it used to carry in his letters. "Amanda saw the children gathered here from the porch. She says it looks disgraceful. A Boston schoolteacher sitting in the dirt with laborers' kin." Eva fastened the brass buckle of her satchel with a sharp click. She stood up and faced him. "Your wife has a narrow view of the world, Julian," Eva said, her voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic cadence. "She thinks value only lives in a vault. But these children are going to run this territory long after your banker's loans are forgotten. If you leave them ignorant, you're just breeding servants for the people who hold your mortgages." Julian's jaw twitched. He looked down at his polished leather boots, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand the spot I'm in, Eva. The Pendleton Bank can break this ranch by November if I don't play by their rules. A man who lets another person tell him who he can teach or who he can respect is already broken." "Julian," Eva said softly, "you didn't just sell me short when you stood at that altar. You sold yourself short." He didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the white-painted main house, his boots kicking up small, hurried puffs of red dust that disappeared into the wind. The storm didn't bring rain. It just brought tension so thick you could taste it on your tongue like copper. For 2 weeks, the ranch existed in an uneasy truce. Eva kept her ledger books immaculate, working by the oil lamp in her cabin until her eyes ached, while Silas handled the herds out on the western range. But a ranch is a small world, and malice has a way of finding its way into the cracks. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, right around the time the heat makes the horses restless in their stalls. Eva was walking back from the well behind her cabin when she heard the shrill, cutting voice of Amanda Pendleton echoing from the main corral. Eva set her bucket down and moved toward the yard. Amanda was standing near the hitching post, her ivory silk skirts gathered up in her gloved hands to keep them out of the manure. Her face was flushed beneath her lace parasol, her eyes fixed on Caleb, the old blacksmith. The old man was standing perfectly still, his leather apron covered in soot, his gray head bowed in a way that made Eva's blood run hot. Julian was there too, shifting from one foot to the other, looking everywhere but at the old man. "He did it on purpose, Julian," Amanda hissed, pointing a trembling, gloved finger at her skirt. A thin streak of black grease, no longer than a horsehair, was smudged near the hem of her expensive dress. "This illiterate savage brushed right past me. This silk came from France, and he ruined it with his filth." Caleb spoke, his voice low, steady, and weary with the weight of 70 years of survival. "I purely didn't see you standing in the shadow of the door. Ma'am, I was carrying a hot shoe to the forge. I mean no disrespect. Don't you speak to me?" Amanda snapped, her voice like the crack of a teamster's whip. She turned to Julian. "I want him off this ranch by sunset. Julian, better yet, have the foreman take a stirrup leather to him. He needs to learn his place." Julian took a step forward, his voice tentative. "Caleb, you should have been looking where you were going. Amanda's father virtually owns the stock in this valley now. We can't have this." Eva didn't think about the pocket pistol in her cloak, or the fact that she was an employee on a ranch that could fire her with a word. She just saw an old man who had survived slavery being brought to his knees by a woman who had never worked an hour in her life. She stepped into the center of the corral, her boots striking the hard-packed dirt with a rhythmic, unhurried cadence. "Stop it, Julian," Eva said. Amanda's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing into two venomous slits. "You stay out of this, schoolteacher. This is ranch business. This old man is our servant." Eva walked right up to Amanda, stopping close enough to see the powder on the woman's nose. She didn't look at the grease smudge on the dress. She looked at Caleb, then back at Amanda. "He is nobody's servant, Amanda," Eva said, her voice dropping into that quiet, dawn-tep tone that made the wranglers by the fence turn to listen. "The law of this country says Caleb is a free man, and the law of this ranch says he earns his bread with the skill of his hands. He pours his sweat into that iron so your carriage horses can walk these rocky trails without breaking their legs. His labor gives this place its value. He's a hand," Amanda yelled, her poise slipping. "He's nothing. Beneath that expensive silk and my blue calico, the Lord put the exact same red blood in our veins," Eva said, her words measured, rhythmic, and heavy with truth. "You don't get to degrade a man's humanity just because your daddy has a larger ledger in San Francisco. Money can buy you silk, Amanda, but it doesn't give you the right to stomp on another human soul." Amanda gasped, turning to her husband. "Are you going to let her speak to me like that? In front of the hands?" Julian opened his mouth, his face turning a deep, painful crimson. He looked at Caleb, then at Eva, then at his wife's furious glare. He looked like a man caught between two fences with a wild bull charging down the middle. "Eva, you should go back to your cabin," Julian muttered, his voice cracking. "Amanda is. She's right about the dress. It was expensive. Is that the price of your dignity, Julian?" Eva asked softly. The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than any insult. A yard of French silk. Before Amanda could scream again, a horse snorted at the edge of the corral. Silas rode in on his big buckskin stallion. He didn't dismount. He just sat in his saddle, his gray eyes taking in the scene. Caleb's bowed head, Eva's straight back, and Julian's miserable face. He took his rope from the saddle horn and began coiling it with slow, methodical movements. "What's the trouble here?" Silas asked, his low, gravelly voice settling over the yard like a wet blanket. "This old man insulted me." "Silas," Amanda cried, trying to regain her footing. "And your clerk here is preaching abolitionist nonsense in my yard." Silas looked at Caleb. "You shoe the buckskin this morning." Caleb: "Yes, sir, Mr. Silas," the old man said quietly. "He's fit for the hills now." Silas looked down at his brother. "Julian, the waterholes on the northern range are drying up fast. The cattle are bunching. I need every hand we've got to move them toward Skull Creek tomorrow morning. That includes Caleb. We don't have time for vanity or dresses." He turned his horse slightly, his gaze falling squarely on Amanda. "This ranch runs on iron and sweat." "Ma'am," Silas said, his voice hard as the Kalish road. "Caleb stays because his hammer keeps us moving. Miss Vance stays because her books keep us honest. If you can't live alongside people who earn their keep, San Francisco is a 3-day ride back west. Julian, get your horse. We got work to do." He didn't wait for an answer. He gave the stallion a nudge with his heel and trotted toward the barn, the rhythm of his horse's hooves breaking the tension in the air. Amanda turned on her heel, her silk dress rustling with fury as she marched back toward the main house, dragging Julian behind her by the invisible gold chain around his neck. Eva walked over to Caleb. The old man was still holding his hammer, his knuckles white against the wood. She laid her hand gently on his leather-apron sleeve. "Are you all right, Mr. Caleb?" she asked softly. Caleb looked up, his old eyes wet but clear. He looked at the white main house, then down at the little school bench under the oak tree where his daughter Ruth was still sitting, watching them. "I've been called worse by better people, Miss Eva," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a thong-dong rhythm of his own. "But it's the first time in my 70 years a white lady stood between me and the whip without being asked. My girl Ruth." She's lucky to be sitting on your log. We're all on the same log, Caleb, Eva said. We just have to remind them of that every now and then. She picked up her bucket of well water and walked back toward her cabin, the water sloshing rhythmically against the tin side. The shadows were lengthening across the valley. But as she looked toward the western hills where Silas was riding, she knew the Sterling Ranch wasn't completely lost. There was still iron in the dirt. There was still decency in the valley. The oil lamp on the oak table was running low on kerosene. It flickered, a small, stubborn yellow tongue of fire that cast long, dancing shadows across the log walls of the cabin. Outside, Skull Creek was singing its late-night song, a low, wet rumble over the smooth river stones. Eva rubbed her eyes with the heels of her palms. Her head ached behind her temples. Before her lay the quarterly ledger for the Sterling Ranch, a heavy, calfskin book with thick, creamy pages that smelled of old ink and iron gall. Silas had brought it down from the office under his arm after dark, his face grim, his boots leaving dark tracks of mountain mud across her floor. Something's wrong with the cattle counts, Eva, he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, gravelly register. The grass is thin this year, but the numbers on the sales don't match the weight we drove to the railhead. Look deep. And she had looked. For 3 hours, she had followed the ink trails left by Julian's fine, flowing penmanship. Julian's handwriting was beautiful. It had elegant loops and delicate slants, the script of a man trained in a Boston counting house. But beneath those pretty lines lay a rotten structure. Eva dipped her steel-nibbed pen into the inkwell, her fingers stained black at the knuckles. She drew a hard, straight line beneath the October column. Her heart didn't thump with fear. It settled into a cold, steady rhythm. She'd seen this kind of ink work before. She had seen it in her father's shop back east, right before the creditors came with their black coats and their eviction notices. A soft step creaked on the porch outside, not the hurried, shuffling gait of Julian's city boots. This was a heavy, deliberate tread. One boot, a pause, the clink of a spur. Silas didn't knock. He just pushed the heavy timber door open, his tall frame cutting off the cool night breeze. He had a tin cup of black coffee in one hand and his whittling knife in the other. He didn't ask if she was tired. He just looked at the ledger, then at her face. "You find the hole in the fence?" Silas asked. He sat down on the bench across from her, his gray eyes steady in the lamplight. "It's not a hole, Silas," Eva said, her voice dropping into the same rhythmic cadence as the creek outside. "It's a tunnel, and it goes all the way under the property." She turned the heavy book toward him, pointing her finger at a column of small, neat figures tucked into the margin of the June expenses. "Look here," Eva said. Julian recorded 500 head of 3-year-old steers sold to the Army contract at Fort Lowell. He wrote down $30 a head. That's $15,000. But look at the banking deposit page from the Tucson town vault. Silas leaned forward, his large, scarred hand resting flat on the table. He squinted at the numbers. "Says 10,000. $5,000 is missing from the cash balance," Eva said, her words measured and sharp. "And it's not just the steers. Look at the land entries. Julian didn't just borrow money to fix the roof on the main house. He signed a predatory deed of trust with Arthur Pendleton, Amanda's father. He used the northern pasture, the whole water right along Skull Creek, as collateral for a private loan." The cabin went dead silent. The only sound was the sharp snap of Silas's whittling knife closing against his palm. His jaw didn't twitch. He didn't curse. He just looked out the small glass window toward the black outline of the hills. "He sold the water," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, turning hard as iron. "Without water, the cattle die in the dust. The cabins by the creek go dry. Caleb's forge can run. He didn't just mortgage the dirt, Eva. He mortgaged every soul that relies on this valley for their bread." "He thought he was being smart," Eva said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "He thought the Pendleton money would make him a big man in the territory. He wanted the shortcut, Silas. He didn't want to wait for the grass to grow or the calves to drop. He wanted to buy his way into a world where men don't have to sweat." Silas stood up, his great shadow stretching across the ceiling. He began to pace the small room, his boots striking the floorboards with a slow, heavy rhythm. Step, pause, step. My old man always said a shortcut is just a long road to someone else's jail, Silas said, stopping by the cold iron stove. A man who tries to build a house out of paper cards shouldn't be surprised when the wind blows it over. But Julian didn't just risk his own skin. He signed away the rights of people who can't read the papers he put his name to. He turned to her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, quiet intensity. You see what he did, Eva? Silas asked, his voice shaking just a fraction. He didn't think about Caleb. He didn't think about Miguel's family down by the cottonwoods. He looked at those folks and he just saw numbers on a list. He didn't see their humanity. He didn't see the years they've spent pouring their lives into this dirt. He thought because they were poor and didn't have a legal title, their rights didn't count. Eva stood up too, her blue calico skirt brushing against the bench. She walked over to him, her hand steady as she laid it on his rough forearm. That's why the paper matters, Silas, Eva said, her voice clear and rhythmic. My father spent his last days trying to teach me that the law isn't just for the man with the gold watch. The law is supposed to be a shield for the small person. Julian thought he could hide this under a beautiful script because he knew Caleb couldn't read it and Miguel couldn't challenge him in a Tucson court. He used his education like a weapon. Can we fight it? Silas asked, his eyes dropping to her hand on his sleeve. We don't fight it with a gun, Silas, Eva said, her voice dropping into a determined whisper. We fight it with the truth. Julian signed this deed as the sole executor of the Sterling estate. But your father's original will the one you showed me in the tin box. It says the land can never be divided or mortgaged without the express written consent of both brothers. Julian lied to the Pendleton Bank. He told them you were a silent partner with no voting right. Silas let out a short, dry bark that sounded like stone hitting stone. I've been a lot of things in my life, Eva, but I never been silent, especially not when a thief comes to the water hole. Tomorrow we take the ledger to the office. Eva said, her words bringing a strange, quiet peace into the cabin. We make Julian sit down at the table, not to threaten him, but to show him what his choices have done. A man who hides from his own mistakes is a slave to his fear. Silas, we have to give your brother a chance to be a man again. Silas reached down, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second before he picked up his lantern. You're a remarkable woman, Evangeline Vance, he said quietly, his voice softening as he reached the door. Julian thought he was leaving you in the dirt when he walked into that church. I think he left his luck behind. Good night, Silas, she said. Good night. Eva, keep that key in the latch. After he left, Eva didn't go to bed. She sat back down at the table, her pen scratching against a clean page in the book. She wasn't just copying numbers now. She was building a wall of facts, line by line, stroke by stroke. In the old days back in Boston, she had felt helpless against the lawyers who took her father's shop. But out here on the frontier, with Silas standing at her back and an honest ledger under her hand, she knew she had the power to protect the people she had come to love. She wrote until the morning light began to turn the gray mountain mist to gold, her heart steady, her purpose clear as the running water of Skull Creek. The air by midday was a dry, brittle thing that smelled of parched pine needles and old ash. The wind had shifted out of the south, blowing hot and steady from the Mexican border, rattling the dry seed pods on the mesquite bushes like a basket of rattlesnakes. Eva stood outside the cabin, her hand shading her eyes as she looked toward the western ridges. The sun was a dull, angry orange ball through a strange, gray haze that was creeping over the rim of the canyon. Smoke, a voice said from the trail. It was Caleb. The old blacksmith was walking toward her, his heavy leather apron gone, an old Sharp's rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. His face was set hard against the glare, range fire out by the northern pastures. Miss Eva, Caleb said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, thong-dong cadence of an old soldier. Mr. Silas and the boys rode out an hour ago. Some wrangler came riding in on a blown horse saying the grass was burning right down by the line cabin. It ain't a natural fire. Wind's too steady. Eva felt a cold spike of dread in her belly, but she kept her voice low. The Rustlers, the bank's men. Caleb spat, his old eyes narrowing as he looked toward the white main house. Arthur Pendleton don't want to wait for a court to decide about that water right. He wants to smoke the cattle out, break the herd before the November payments are due. A man with a mortgage don't need a sheriff if he can use a match. Where is Julian? Eva asked. In the big house, Caleb said, his thumb gesturing over his shoulder. With his lady. Doors locked. Windows shut. He's pretending the sky ain't turning black. Eva didn't hesitate. She grabbed her woolen cloak from the porch peg and pulled it tight over her calico sleeves. Caleb, stay here by the cabins. Keep the children down by the creek where the mud is deep. If the wind shifts, that oak tree will catch. Where you going, child? Caleb asked, his hand reaching out to stop her. I'm going to the stables, Eva said, her steps already falling into that sharp, rhythmic beat on the dirt trail. Silas is out there alone with 6 hands. If they get pinned against the canyon wall, they'll need every horse we've got to move the stock. She didn't wait for Caleb's protest. She ran down the path, her boots kicking up small, hurried flurries of red kellish. The air was growing thicker now, stinging her throat, tasting of scorched greasewood and bitter smoke. By the time she reached the main corral, the sky had turned the color of an old bruise. 2 young wranglers were trying to saddle a pair of nervous pack mules, their hands shaking as the animals snorted and reared against the hemp ropes. Miss Vance, one of the boys yelled through the haze. You get back to the creek. The whole North Range is going up. Give me the bay mare, Eva said, her voice cutting through the panic like a sharp blade. And pack those saddlebags with every wet gunny sack you can find in the wash house. Move, the boy didn't argue. There was something in Eva's face, the same fierce, quiet dignity she'd carried into the Tucson church that made him drop his rope and run for the mare. 10 minutes later, Eva was in the saddle. She wasn't a frontier rider, but she knew how to hold a rein, and her father had taught her that fear was just an emotion that could be mastered with a clear head. She rode up the canyon trail, her face wrapped in a wet cotton handkerchief, the bay mare picking her way through the rocks with a frantic, rhythmic stride. The world on the ridge was a nightmare of red and gray. The fire was running through the dry bear grass like a line of spilled gunpowder, jumping from one greasewood bush to the next with a loud, terrifying roar that sounded like a freight train coming down a mountain. Through the shifting curtains of gray smoke, she saw them. Silas was on foot. His buckskin stallion was tied to a scorched juniper tree, its eyes white with terror. Silas was right at the edge of the flames, his shirt torn at the shoulder, his face black with soot as he used a wet burlap sack to beat back a line of fire that was creeping toward a group of 30 mother cows, and their calves huddled in a rocky corner of the canyon wall. The 6 hands were scattered along the ridge, their voices lost in the roar of the wind, their horses screaming as the heat rolled over the rocks. Eva lunged the bay mare down the steep slope, sliding through the loose shale. She jumped out of the saddle before the horse could bolt, grabbing the heavy saddlebag bags filled with the wet sacks she'd brought from the ranch. Silas, she screamed through the smoke. He turned, his gray eyes wild and bloodshot through the black grime on his face. When he saw her, his jaw tightened in a look that was half fury and half sheer relief. He ran to her, his large hands grabbing her by the shoulders. What are you doing here? He roared over the sound of the flames. I told you to stay by the creek. The bank isn't waiting for the paper. Silas, Eva shouted back, pressing a fresh, wet sack into his hands. They tried to buy your brother, and now they're trying to burn you out. We move these cows now, or we lose the whole foundation. Silas looked at the cows, then at the narrow gap in the smoke toward the south. His shirt was smoking at the cuff, and an angry red blister was already forming across his left forearm where a falling branch had struck him. The gap's closing fast. Eva, Silas said, his voice dropping into that steady, gravelly rhythm even in the middle of the inferno. Take the mare and lead the calves. They'll follow the horse if they can't smell the fire. I'll bring up the rear with the bulls. We do it together. Silas, Eva said, her words steady, her eyes locking onto his through the gray haze, line by line. For the next 2 hours, the world was nothing but heat, sweat, and the smell of burning hair. Eva rode the mare ahead of the herd, her voice calling out to the frightened cattle with a clear, rhythmic chant she'd used to keep her schoolchildren in line. Come on, cattle, step, move, follow the trail. It wasn't a cowboy's yell. It was a human voice, steady and full of authority, carrying through the roar of the fire. Silas worked behind her, his large frame moving through the smoke like a shadow, his wet sack beating back the flames whenever they crept too close to a lingering calf. He didn't think about his burned arm. He didn't think about his ruined shirt. He just kept his eyes on the herd, respecting the lives of the animals, refusing to let the Pendleton fire destroy the work of his father's hands. By the time they reached the cool, muddy flats of Skull Creek, the wind had finally died down, leaving the fire to burn itself out against the barren rock of the upper ridges. The cattle splashed into the shallow water, their tongues hanging out, their sides heaving with exhaustion. The 6 hands dropped from their saddles, their faces black, their clothes smelling of old charcoal. But every single cow and every single calf was accounted for. Eva climbed down from the bay mare, her legs shaking so hard she had to lean against the saddle for support. Her green traveling dress was ruined, the hem was scorched black, and the calico sleeves were torn to ribbons. But as she looked at the water running clear over the river stones, she knew they had won. Silas walked over to her. He didn't care that the hands were watching. He didn't care about the smoke or the grime. He reached out and took her hands in his large, calloused fingers warm and trembling slightly against her skin. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Evangeline," Silas said, his voice rough and low, dropping into that quiet, conversational rhythm that made her heart race faster than the fire had. Julian thought he left a city girl in Tucson. He didn't know he was letting go of the iron that holds this whole valley together. Eva looked up into his slate-gray eyes, the soot on his face making them seem brighter, like silver found deep in the rock. "My father always told me that a person's true character isn't revealed when the sun is shining," Silas, Eva said, her voice soft but clear as the creek. "It's revealed when the brush catches fire, and you have to decide what you're willing to stand for. Today we stood for the people who rely on this water. We stood for each other." Silas didn't say anything more. He just squeezed her hands, his thumb tracing a gentle circle over her knuckles, before turning to help Caleb lead the cattle toward the lower corrals. As Eva walked back toward her small cabin, she saw Julian standing on the porch of the main house. He looked clean. His linen shirt was white, and his boots were polished. But as he looked down at his brother, scorched clothes, and at Eva's ruined dress, he looked smaller than he ever had before. He looked like a ghost wandering through a world he no longer understood. Eva didn't look back at him. She turned her key in the cabin door, her heart light, her soul whole, knowing that the fire had only burned away the things that didn't matter, leaving the iron beneath the dirt strong and true. The smell of old char didn't leave the valley with the fire. It lingered in the early morning air, sharp and bitter, settling over the creek like a gray shroud. Eva sat at her small oak table, her fingers tracing the ink lines in the tin box she had hauled from the stables. It was barely 7. Outside, a light dew had tried to green the unburnt grass, but the dirt road leading down from the town was already dry, sending up small, warning plumes of dust before the wheels even appeared. First came the sound of iron-rimmed wheels, heavy, expensive. A black leather buggy pulled by 2 high-stepping gray mares rolled into the ranch yard. Arthur Pendleton sat on the bench, his wool coat dark as a crow's wing, a thick gold chain hanging across his round belly. Next to him was a territorial deputy with a shiny tin star pinned to his vest, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Amanda stood on the porch of the main house, her morning gown trailing on the whitewashed wood. Julian was behind her. He hadn't shaved. His linen shirt looked wrinkled, like he slept in a chair, his eyes fixed on the dust his father-in-law had raised. Eva rose from her chair, tucked the tin box under her arm, and walked out into the yard. Silas was already there. He was standing by the hitching post, his burned arm wrapped in clean white cotton, his old Stetson pulled low. He didn't have his rifle out, but his boots were planted wide, his heels dug deep into the callous dirt. Arthur Pendleton didn't get down from his buggy. He just held the leather reins in one gloved hand and looked over the yard like a landlord counting his fence posts. "Julian," Pendleton called out, his voice sharp and businesslike, the tone of a man used to foreclosing on widows before dinner. "Get down here. The territorial court in Tucson signed the papers yesterday. The default on the northern range is official. We rehear to fence off the water rights along this creek." Julian took 3 slow steps down the porch stairs, his boots clicking hollowly against the wood. "Arthur, the fire. We lost 50 acres of grass. Silas says the cattle can't survive if you wire off the creek." "The cattle aren't my concern," Pendleton said, pulling a folded parchment from his vest pocket. "The paper says the northern range belongs to the Pendleton Bank if the October note isn't paid in full. $500. Julian, you don't have it. And your brother's stubbornness doesn't change the interest rate." Amanda leaned against the porch rail, a smug, cold smile playing on her. "I told you, Julian, this valley belongs to people who know how to manage a fortune. It's time to let the laborers go." Silas didn't move an inch. "That paper ain't worth the ink Julian used to sign it." "Pendleton." The deputy shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his holster. "Keep your mouth shut, Silas. The law is the law. Your brother is the sole executor of this estate. He lied to you." A voice called out. Eva walked into the center of the circle, her boots striking the dirt in that steady, unhurried cadence. She set the tin box flat on the buckboard wagon beside the buggy. She didn't look at Amanda. She looked straight at the banker. "My father was a bookkeeper, Mr. Pendleton," Eva said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic, conversational thong-dong that made everyone go quiet. "He taught me that a bad contract is just a lie with a notary stamp on it. Julian signed your deed of trust in June. But look at this paper." She pulled a yellow document from the tin box, their father's original homestead deed from 1872. "This is the founding charter of the Sterling Ranch," Eva said, her fingers steady against the parchment. "Section 4 says the land, the water rights, and the timber can never be sold, divided, or used as collateral unless both brothers put their names to the ink. Silas never signed your note. Julian forged his partner's consent to get your $500. Pendleton's face hardened, turning the color of wet clay. He snatched the paper from Eva's hand, his eyes scanning the old script. "This is a territory deed. My lawyers in San Francisco already cleared the title. Your lawyers didn't look in this tin box," Eva said, her voice dantep and clear. "Julian used a beautiful script to hide a criminal fraud. He gave you a piece of paper he didn't own, to buy a life he didn't earn." Amanda stormed down the stairs, her silk skirts dragging in the dirt. "Julian, tell them she's lying. This is our ranch. My father gave you everything." Julian looked at the yellow deed in Pendleton's hand. He looked at Silas, who was standing there like a mountain that wouldn't move. He looked at Eva, the woman he had abandoned, who was now using her father's learning to save his family's land. A long, terrible silence hung over the yard. The only sound was the wind rattling the dry leaves of the live oak tree. "She's right, Arthur," Julian said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. "I forged Silas's mark. I was afraid of losing the bank's favor. I didn't think Silas would find out until the spring." Amanda gasped, stepping back from him like he was a leper. You miserable coward. You ruined everything. The fraud voids the deed." "Mr. Pendleton," Eva said, her words falling like stones into a well, "the deputy knows the law. You can't foreclose on an illegal contract. But we aren't thieves on this ranch. We pay our debts." She reached into her woolen cloak and pulled out a certified bank draft from the Boston legal estate, the $500 insurance money her father had left her, the final harvest of his honest life. She laid it flat on the buckboard next to the tin box. "This is $500 in gold coin, drawn on the federal treasury," Eva said. "It covers the October note in full. The Sterling Ranch owes your bank nothing. You take your buggy, you take your daughter, and you get off this waterhole." Pendleton stared at the gold draft. His knuckles turned white on the reins. He knew the law, and he knew when a clerk had beaten him at his own game. He looked at the deputy, who slowly took his hand off his pistol and shook his head. "Get in the buggy, Amanda," Pendleton muttered, his voice cold as winter ice. "Father," Amanda screamed. "You can't let them keep this dirt." "Get in," he roared. Amanda looked at Julian, her eyes full of pure, unadulterated venom. She didn't offer a hand or a word of goodbye. She climbed onto the leather seat, wrapped her silk cloak around her shoulders, and stared straight ahead as her father slammed the whip against the horses' backs. The black buggy lunged forward, turning out of the gate, leaving nothing but a thick cloud of red dust that drifted away into the desert. Julian stood alone in the middle of the yard. He looked at his brother, then at Eva. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a cage only to find he had nowhere left to walk. "Thank you, Eva," Julian said, his voice broken. "I don't deserve this." "You don't," Silas said, stepping forward, his gray eyes softening just a fraction as he looked at his brother's slumped shoulders. "But our father didn't build this ranch for one man's vanity, Julian. He built it for the family. You go inside. Wash your face. Tomorrow we start recalculating the herds." Together Julian nodded once, his head bowed, and walked slowly toward the empty main house. Eva began packing the old deeds back into the tin box, her fingers trembling slightly now that the dust had settled. Silas walked over, his massive, scarred hand reaching down to help her close the brass latch. "My father used to say that gold can buy a lot of things, Eva," Silas said, his low voice steady and warm beside her. "But it can't buy the truth. You used your learning to protect people who didn't even know they were being robbed. That draft was your whole inheritance. Why did you give it to this dirt?" Eva looked up into his slate-gray eyes, her heart filling with a quiet, certain warmth. "Because my father didn't leave me that money to buy a dress or a ticket back to a city full of walls." "Silas," Eva said, her voice rhythmic and clear. "He left it to me so I could stand on a piece of ground where people are treated with dignity. This ranch is my home now, and you can't put a price on home." The October air was crisp, carrying the sweet, clean scent of curing mountain grass and wild desert marigolds. The noon sun didn't burn today. It just poured a soft, golden light over the valley, making the red rocks of the canyon look like they'd have been painted by a gentle hand. Beneath the wide, welcoming canopy of the great live oak tree near Skull Creek, the dirt had been swept clean of every rock and twig. Silas' split-log benches had been arranged in a wide semicircle. Today they weren't filled with slate tablets or river stones. They were filled with people. Caleb sat in the front row, his clean linen shirt white against his dark skin, his daughter Ruth sitting proud beside him. Miguel's family was there too, the women wearing their best embroidered shawls, their children sitting perfectly still for once in their lives. Even Julian was there. He sat on the far end of the bench, his hair neatly trimmed, wearing his old working clothes. He didn't look at the ground anymore. He looked at his brother with a quiet, respectful eye. Eva stood inside her small log cabin, looking at herself in the small cracked glass mirror above the washstand. She wasn't wearing ivory silk from France. She was wearing her blue calico dress, the one she had stitched herself under the light of the oil lamp, the seams straight and strong, built to last. She didn't have a lace parasol or a velvet purse. She just had a bunch of yellow desert marigolds pinned into her auburn hair, their petals bright as the morning sun. A soft knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Caleb standing on the porch. He was holding an old silver pocket watch in his palm, the one Silas' father had carried when he first crossed the territory. "Time to walk down to the log, Miss Eva," Caleb said, his old voice dropping into that rhythmic, thong-dong cadence that felt like a blessing. "The whole creek is waiting for you." Eva took his arm, her hand resting light against his rough sleeve. "Thank you, Caleb, I'm ready." They walked down the dirt path together, their steps matching the slow, steady gurgle of the water. As they reached the shade of the live oak, the crowd stood up from the benches. There was no whispering today, no snickering or measuring a person's worth by the cost of her cuffs. There was just the quiet, reverent respect of people who knew they were standing on free ground. Silas stood by the trunk of the tree. He had traded his work shirt for a clean black wool coat, but his Stetson was the same, and his gray eyes were bright as silver found deep in the rock. When he saw Eva walking toward him through the golden light, his jaw softened, a smile breaking across his weathered face that made him look younger than he had in years. The town preacher, an old man with a Bible worn soft at the corners, stepped between them. "We regathered here under God's sky," the preacher said, his voice echoing through the oak leaves, "to join this man and this woman in a covenant that doesn't rely on the courts of men or the wealth of banks. It relies on the truth they've found in each other." He looked at Silas. "Silas Sterling, do you take this woman to be your wedded wife?" Silas didn't look at the preacher. He kept his eyes locked on Eva's face, his large, scarred hand reaching out to wrap around her fingers with a firm, protective warmth. "I do," Silas said, his low, gravelly voice steady and clear, ringing out across the creek. "Julian wanted a woman who was on time for his vanity. I thank the dusty road for making you late, Eva, because it gave me the chance to choose a woman who is timeless. I promise to honor you as my equal partner, in the shadow of the sun or the depth of the winter, building a home where every soul is welcome." The vaquero women wiped their eyes with their shawls, and Caleb nodded his head once, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. The preacher turned to Eva. "Evangeline Vance, do you take this man to be your wedded husband?" Eva looked at the white scar through Silas's eyebrow, the pale rope burns on his hands, and the fierce, quiet devotion in his gray eyes. She felt her father's spirit close by, smiling under that live oak tree. "I do," Eva said, her voice clear, rhythmic, and heavy with a love that had grown out of the ashes of her broken dreams. "I came west looking for a shortcut to security, Silas. But you showed me that true security isn't something someone gives you. It's something you build, line by line, with a partner who sees your worth. I choose you, today and every day, as my equal, my shield, and my home." The preacher smiled, laying his hands over theirs. "By the authority vested in me by this territory and the spirit of this frontier, I pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, kiss your bride." Silas pulled her close, his strong arms wrapping around her calico waist. And when he kissed her, the crowd under the oak tree erupted into a loud, joyous cheer that carried all the way down the canyon. Caleb's hammer didn't ring today, but the laughter of the children on the creek bank was music enough. The reception was held right there in the yard, with wooden tables set up under the sun and platters of beef stew and sourdough bread prepared by the ranch families. There was no champagne, but the well water was sweet, and the wine they poured from the Spanish skins was dark and rich. Julian walked over to the table where Eva and Silas were sitting. He held a silver cup in his hand, his face serious but clear of the old shadows. "I want to make a toast," Julian said, his voice steadying as the hands turned to listen. "To my brother, who was smart enough to see the iron in the dirt when I only saw the gold in the vault. And to Eva, who taught me that a man who sells his honor short will always end up bankrupt. You two make sense in a way this ranch hasn't since our father passed. May your ledger always balance." Silas stood up and clinked his cup against his brother's. "Thank you. Julian, tomorrow, the horses need branding. Don't be late." Julian smiled an honest, boyish smile and nodded. "I'll be there." As the sun began to dip toward the western ridges, painting the Arizona sky in shades of crimson, violet, and deep, burning gold, Silas pulled Eva away from the crowd, leading her down toward the porch of their small cabin by Skull Creek. They sat together on the wooden bench, watching the shadows stretch across the valley they had saved. "Are you happy, Eva?" Silas asked, his voice a quiet rumble against her ear as he laced his fingers through hers. "Happier than I ever thought possible on this earth, Silas," Eva whispered, her head resting flat against his broad shoulder. "A year ago, I was sitting in an empty shop in Boston, wondering how a person survives when the world takes everything they have. I never could have imagined this valley. The road was long, Eva," Silas said, looking at the stars that were just beginning to blink into the blue evening sky. But it brought you to the right station. I was late for one destiny. Silas, Eva said, her words moving with the gentle, rhythmic cadence of the running water below them. But I was exactly on time for the one that mattered. They sat in the quiet dark, the lamp in their cabin window glowing with a warm, steady light that wouldn't flicker out. Two souls who had found their home in each other on the wild edge of a free world. The valley didn't change its name, but 5 years can change the weight of the dirt beneath a man's boots. Eva stood on the porch of the newly expanded cabin by Skull Creek. The logs had seasoned now, turning a deep, rich cedar brown that looked right at home against the gray canyon rock. It was May, and the desert was doing its short, beautiful dance. The hillsides were carpeted in bright orange poppies and yellow marigolds, their scent sweet and sharp in the cool morning air. Down by the big live oak, a building stood where there used to be nothing but a split log bench. It was small, built of sturdy red adobe bricks that Caleb had helped bake in his kiln, with a real glass window that caught the first rays of the sun. A brass bell hung from a pine crossbeam out front. Eva reached up and pulled the hemp rope. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was crisp, ringing out across the water, echoing off the stone walls of the canyon. First came the boots, a whole chorus of them, running down the dirt trail. 10 children tumbled out of the cottonwoods, their laughter cutting through the morning mist. There was Miguel's youngest lad, wearing a clean cotton shirt, his slate tablet tucked under his arm. Right beside him ran Caleb's grandson, little Silas, his dark face split by a wide, gap-toothed grin. They weren't walking on opposite sides of the path anymore. They were racing each other to the doorstep, their heels kicking up small, identical clouds of red dust. Eva watched them scramble inside, her heart settling into that familiar, rhythmic thong-dong. A heavier step sounded on the porch behind her. Silas walked out from the kitchen, a tin mug of coffee in his hand. His black wool coat from their wedding day was gone, replaced by his old, comfortable denim shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the faded pink scar on his forearm. He laid his large, rough hand flat against the small of her back, his warmth seeping through her calico dress. "They're getting faster," Silas said, his low, gravelly voice a gentle rumble in the quiet morning. "They're growing," Eva said, leaning her head back against his broad shoulder. "And they're hungry to learn. That's the best kind of fast." Silas looked down toward the stables. A new corral had been built out past the blacksmith shop, filled with 20 head of fine, blooded Hereford bulls. Julian was standing by the gate, a pencil tucked behind his ear, talking with a local cattle buyer from Phoenix. Julian didn't look at his pocket watch every 2 minutes anymore. He held a leather ledger in his own hands, his posture straight, his voice carrying an honest, steady ring across the yard. 2 years back, Julian had married Sarah, a quiet, sensible widow from the next valley over. Sarah knew the price of alfalfa and didn't care a lick about San Francisco silk. Together, they had turned the old main house into a trading post for the valley's homesteaders, running the books as clean and straight as a plumb line. Julian found his footing, Silas noted, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He found a purpose that didn't belong to someone else, Eva said softly. A man who builds his own value doesn't need to steal it from his neighbors. Silas nodded, his thumb tracing a slow, rhythmic circle against her waist. "That bank draft you gave Pendleton 5 years ago. I used to think it was just money, but looking at that schoolhouse, and looking at my brother, I see it now. You didn't just buy the pasture, Eva. You bought the time we needed to become human beings again. Knowledge and freedom." "Silas," Eva said, turning to look up into his slate-gray eyes. "They're like water in the desert. You don't store them in a vault to let them get stagnant. You let them flow so everybody can drink. That's how you keep the valley from turning back into a wilderness." He smiled, that rare, deep crinkle around his eyes that always made her breath catch. He tipped his Stetson, gave her hand a firm, lingering squeeze, and walked down the steps toward the corrals, his spurs clinking out their slow, dependable music against the hard-packed caliche. Eva walked into the adobe schoolhouse. The room was cool, the thick mud walls keeping the mountain heat at bay. The children were already sitting at their desks, real desks, that Silas and Caleb had crafted out of native pine. Ruth, Caleb's oldest girl, was standing by the blackboard. She was 14 now, her braids pinned up like a grown woman's, her handwriting neat and elegant on the slate. She was the assistant teacher now, helping the younger ones with their sums. "Morning, Miss Vance," the children chorused, their voices rising up together in a beautiful, unforced harmony. "Morning, children," Eva said, setting her ledger flat on her table. "Ruth, what's our lesson for today?" Ruth turned to the blackboard, her chalk scratching out 3 words in bold, white strokes: the common good. "We're reading from the Territorial Charter, ma'am," Ruth said, her voice clear and full of a quiet, unshakable dignity, "about how the water belongs to the creek, and the creek belongs to everyone who uses it right." Eva sat on the edge of her table, her blue calico skirt brushing the pine floor. She looked at the faces before her, the dark eyes, the light eyes, the children of men who had been slave slaves and men who had been masters, all sitting on the same pine benches, reading from the same page. "That's right, Ruth," Eva said, her voice dropping into that steady, conversational rhythm that held the room still. "Out here on the frontier, it's easy to think that the person with the biggest gun or the deepest vault makes the rules. But a territory can't survive on force alone. A true community is built on a contract of mutual respect. If you don't protect the rights of the smallest family on this creek, then your own rights aren't worth the paper they're written on." Miguel S. Boy, little Tomas, raised his hand. "Is that why Mr. Silas didn't let the banker put the wire up?" "That's exactly why," Eva said, her words measured and clear. "The wire keeps people out, but it also locks your own soul in a cage. We don't use fences to divide our humanity, Tomas. We use our learning to make sure the door stays open for everyone who's willing to do honest work." From outside, the steady, rhythmic clink-clink-clink of Caleb's hammer started up at the forge. It was a familiar sound, the heartbeat of the Sterling Ranch. But today it didn't sound like a heavy chain. It sounded like a bell, marking the hours of a life they had chosen for themselves. The morning passed in a thong-dong rhythm of reading, writing, and the clean, sharp smell of cedar pencils. By noon the hot wind began to stir the cottonwood leaves, and Eva dismissed the class. Watching the children spill out into the sunshine like calves let out of a pen, she walked out to the porch, her satchel over her shoulder, and found Silas waiting by the hitching post with 2 saddled horses, the bay mare and his big buckskin stallion. "Where are we going?" Eva asked, a light breeze catching the marigolds in her hair. "Up to the high ridge," Silas said, helping her up into the saddle. He didn't lift her like she was fragile. He gave her his hand, matching her strength, treating her as his equal partner on the trail. "The grass is high by the old line cabin. I want to show you something." They rode up the canyon path, the horses' hooves clicking a steady, ancient rhythm against the red shale. The black scars from the wildfire of 5 years ago were almost gone, covered over by fresh green brush and clumps of yellow desert bunchgrass. Life had returned to the ridges, stronger and deeper than before because the roots had held through the flames. When they reached the summit, Silas pulled his stallion to a halt. Below them stretched the whole valley of Skull Creek. You could see the adobe schoolhouse, the whitewashed trading post, the corrals filled with healthy cattle, and the small green squares of the kitchen gardens by the laborers' cabins. Smoke was rising from Caleb's chimney, a thin blue ribbon of peace drifting up into the infinite Arizona sky. Silas dismounted and stood by her stirrup, his hand resting on the bay mare's neck. He looked out over the land his father had found, the land his brother had almost lost, and the land this Boston schoolteacher had helped him redeem. "Do you ever regret it, Eva?" Silas asked, his gray eyes turning to her face, steady and clear in the high-altitude light. "Being late for that stage, missing out on the city life you were supposed to have." Eva looked down at her scorched stirrup leathers, then at her calloused hands, and finally into the honest, scarred face of the cowboy beside her. She felt the cool mountain wind on her skin, and she knew her father's dream had been fulfilled in a way neither of them could have written in a book. "I thought I was looking for a shortcut to a safe life when I left Boston, Silas," Eva said, her voice rhythmic, natural, and full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. I thought I needed a man who wrote beautiful letters to give me a place in the world, but if I had arrived on time, I would have married a man who was a slave to his own fear. I would have been an outsider in a house built on paper cards. She slid down from the saddle, her boots hitting the earth with a solid, permanent thunk. She walked right into Silas's arms, her hands wrapping around his broad, denim-clad shoulders. Arriving late was the greatest blessing of my life. Silas Sterling, Eva whispered against his cheek, her voice moving with the cadence of the valley below, because it made me stop looking for someone to save me. It brought me to a man who helped me find my own strength. We didn't just inherit this ranch, Silas, we built something real. Something that will outlast the wire and the banks. Silas pulled her close, his strong arms holding her tight against his chest as the noon sun poured its gold over the ridges. He didn't say any more words, because out here on the frontier, when the ledger balances and the water runs free, the silence tells you everything you need to know. They stood together on the high ground, partners in every sense of the word, watching the next generation take their place in a story that had begun with betrayal, but had blossomed into absolute justice.
The opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience's viewing experience. That brings our journey down along Skull Creek to a close, but it marks the true beginning of a legacy that'll outlast any courthouse record or copper coin in the territory. When we look back at Evangeline Vance, stepping off that dying stagecoach into the suffocating Tucson heat, it's easy to think that the desert itself is the ultimate test of a human soul. But as we've seen plain as day, the most barren, unforgiving wilderness isn't made of sun-baked caliche or smoking timber. It's found in the hollow, transactional hearts of folks like Julian Sterling and Amanda Pendleton. They looked at a vulnerable, penniless orphan girl and saw a piece of baggage to be discarded, measuring the entire world by the weight of a banker's vault and a yard of imported French silk. But this story stands as a fierce reminder that a human being's dignity is not a commodity to be bartered, depreciated, or sold short. Money can buy a fancy watch or a silk dress, but it can never purchase a man's honor, and it sure as hell can't appraisal the worth of a free woman who refuses to bend her knees to tyranny. Eva survived the sting of betrayal because she carried her father's wisdom like a shield, knowing that knowledge is the one asset no creditor can ever confiscate. When she stood beneath that great live oak tree and looked at the children of men who had been slaves and men who had been masters, she didn't see divisions. She saw a single riverbed. She used her father's insurance money not to buy a ticket back to a city of walls, but to anchor a community of equals, proving that true literacy is the first step to freedom. And she found her perfect match in Silas Sterling, a rugged, broad-shouldered man who knew that a shortcut is just a long road to someone else's jail. Silas showed us that true power doesn't hide behind locked doors or clean linen shirts. It stands out in the smoke of the burning brush, beating back the flames to protect the livelihood of the smallest family on the creek. He didn't offer Eva the hollow gesture of charity that makes the giver feel large and the receiver feel small. He offered her a fair contract between equals, a key to her own territory, and an unyielding partner for the trail. When the old territory deed was pulled from that tin box, it shattered Julian's house of cards because it was backed by the unwritten law of this frontier, the law that says if you don't protect the rights of the person sitting next to you, your own freedom is nothing but a lie. Today, that adobe schoolhouse and those fine Hereford cattle stand, as living proof that a community isn't built by a corrupt statute in a leather-bound ledger, but by what we choose to give the children. So, as the paper lanterns flicker out under the cottonwood trees, and the evening wind carries the scent of wild marigolds up to the high ridge, let this story settle deep into your marrow. Never look down on a person because of the grime on their sleeves. Never bow your head to a speculator with a gold chain across his vest. And remember that being late for an earthly destiny might just mean you're exactly on time for the one that matters. Evangeline Vance Maddox didn't just survive the wilderness. She and Silas redeemed it, building a home where the water runs free, the scales are balanced, and every soul can look at the sky and walk tall. Thank you for listening, friends. May your own trail always bring you to honest work, a true partner, and a place where a man's word remains the only currency that never loses its value. Good night.